Well, it's been a few days since the Liberal government started releasing some of the Alward government's confidential forestry agreements. And groups that work with New Brunswick forests say the more they look at what's being signed, the more their concerns are growing, especially with the amount of control the province is handing to private companies. Roberta Clowater is Executive Director of the New Brunswick chapter of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. She's with me in the studio. And on the line is Ken Hardie. He's manager of the New Brunswick Federation of Woodlot Owners. Good morning to you both. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Morning, Terry.
Okay, Roberta Clowater, I'll start with you. What stands out for you as you looked at these confidential agreements?
I think the thing that's most concerning to us is that government has turned over control of decision-making on Crown forests to a private company. And this is not something that most people would assume that they had actually given the government authority to do. And it is really concerning to us that for the next 30 years, this contract basically locks the government into they will not be able to add new conservation rules. They will not be able to add any new forestry rules without getting the approval of the company. And this is just totally stripping the decision-making authority away from the Crown, from the provincial government.
Can you envision any business case that would have justified that action on the part of the government?
Well, I can't imagine that there's enough of a business case to go to such drastic lengths. We were already concerned when they were making these binding agreements for an amount of wood supply that they would be required to provide to the company over the next 25 years. And now this is, on top of all of that, they're also giving them the control over what kind of rules they'll have to follow on Crown land. So I can't see why they needed to add that other insult on top of the first injury. And I think New Brunswickers really need to be concerned about this as this is a public good, public commons, the public forest of New Brunswick, and now the government will not have the ability to make decisions about that without getting the approval of the company.
Is there any precedent for this action anywhere?
I have not heard anybody else across Canada or other parts of North America where something like this might have happened. And certainly it goes above and beyond what most provinces would do as a way of making sure that the forest industry is strong. No other provinces have ever gone to this length of turning over control of the public forests.
What circumstances are unique to New Brunswick which would allow this environment, this scenario to have happened?
Well, I have to question that too. I don't really understand why anybody who works for government or why anyone who is a representative of the public, an elected representative, would think that they have the power and authority to do this, to basically strip power from any other future government for the next generation of people to make decisions of what has to happen on our public, our Crown land. And I find it really disturbing that they feel that they can make these kinds of decisions and not suffer the consequences.
Mr. Hardie, what's your reading of the material that you saw?
Well, my read would be quite similar to what Roberta has just said. From a woodlot perspective, I mean, one of the key concerns we've had is, that we're enabled to stay in business into the future, too. So this additional 690,000 cubic meters being pressed into the market from public land would, put us in a situation where it's unclear what will happen. I mean, the MOA with JDI clearly states that they'll have a need for private wood, but there's no mechanisms in the agreement that indicates how that's guaranteed or insured, similar to the agreement in its current form.
So there's no mechanism that you are aware of in this agreement which would force the company to buy a percentage of wood from the woodlot owners?
No, and to a certain degree, from our perspective, it's a missed opportunity. I think the government could have, not that I would endorse what has happened, but they could have built something in that would have made it a little bit more palatable for woodlot owners. And I kind of draw your attention to the fact that early on, Donald Arsenault, who's now a minister in the government, former minister, said that, Paul Robichaud has signed a 25-year deal with JDI, and he does not have one clue where the wood will come from. It really compromises. And I think what people listening got to take into to think hard about is this is till 2037. Well, how will our society, what will change, what will conservation values be, what will needs of the public be that far into the future? I mean, times will change.
Roberta, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's one of our main concerns, too, is that it's such a long time period to be making these kinds of commitments to. Basically, the agreement says we won't change the rules unless you agree as a company. And so if something happens with respect to climate change impacts on our forest, if some new insect comes in and starts reducing the productivity of the forest, or we learn more about what we actually need to do to conserve habitats and rivers on our public land, we can't introduce any new rules in the meantime to do that. And this is the concern we have with and we hope that the provincial government will actually take a hard look at this and decide that they need to do something, step in and do something to address these problems.
I guess in the preamble to the agreement that I read, the government makes the statement, or the Alward government made the statement on behalf of New Brunswickers, that it was attempting to bring this plan in to help the forest industry remain competitive globally. I mean, doesn't that have some value?
It has some value, I would suggest, but how does a provincial government in the world we live in today and the market forces that come into play, how can they make a statement like that? There's things that will happen globally that are beyond the scope of our provincial government. And we can't lose sight that there's also three key beneficiaries in this agreement. What about the rest of the companies in the province?
Mm-hmm. The Gallant government says it needs a bit of time to go over the deals until next April. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I'm hopeful that this means that they will actually bring more people into the dialogue and start talking with people who have different kinds of interests. So researchers, people who know about wildlife habitat, who have concerns about the current plan and what it's going to do to remove wildlife habitat on Crown land, and also bring in First Nations and the woodlot owners and conservation organizations and anybody who cares about Crown land. There was a suggestion last week that maybe there needs to be a legislative committee, and that seems like a good open way of having this dialogue in the public. But I'm concerned that there's too much discussion going on behind the scenes and not enough in the light of day.
But aren't we just going in a big circle here? I mean, if you go back to the Select Committee on Crown Forests, chaired by Kirk MacDonald, which was really an assessment of the drive to Yakopuri and more tree plantations in the province, turning more forest over to tree plantations. I mean, the committee was pretty clear about what it said, and that was New Brunswickers don't want, or we've been told, New Brunswickers don't want that to happen, and yet here we are, it has happened, and now you're suggesting another committee.
Well,
I mean, aren't we spinning our wheels?
If the government is going to take some time to make their decision, the last I had heard was 6 weeks, so taking it to April is a little bit of a surprise to me. But if they were going to take January to make some decisions, then, or even into February, then they could have a legislative committee that's actually doing this in the light of day. I think also that people need to take the conversations that they're having about this issue away from the coffee shops where they're just talking amongst their friends, and actually talk to decision makers about this, because I feel like there's a lot of venting going on. There's a lot of concern that I'm hearing, and people are talking to their friends and coworkers about it maybe, but they aren't necessarily communicating with the decision makers. And I think that the decision makers really need to hear loud and clear that this is not something that New Brunswickers expect of their government, and then they would like to have the provincial government make changes to this agreement so that all of this stripping of control away from the government is removed.
Mr. Hardie, on the question about spinning our wheels, I mean, after the Select Committee's report and its recommendations ignored, now is it time to have another conversation about that? And what guarantee is there that a subsequent conversation would have any real and lasting effect either?
Well, to a certain degree, I agree with you, Terry. I mean, we've been, through forest summits and select committees, and I mean, this has been studied and commented on to death. From my cynical perspective, at times, we've just kind of kept at it until we got the right answer that some of the companies wanted. And I mean, if it takes a legislative committee with a strong mandate, perhaps that is the way we should go. But on the other hand, as I said, I do agree with the spinning the wheels concept, because anybody who has been around the industry for any period of time knows that this has been studied to death. Let alone the fact I would say that there's a group of dedicated and highly qualified foresters and administrators that work for Department of Natural Resources, I believe, which are good people, have made good recommendations that have been totally ignored also, and the decisions were made in the political arena, not on good science.
Well, that's where I was going with my next question. I know when this was presented to the people, both David Allward and Paul Robichaud said, this is all based on good science. In fact, Jim Irving said that on the show. This is all based on good science. Did either of you see in any of the documentation you looked at that was released any of the good science? No.
I mean, all the science that I've seen would be totally contradicting the conclusions that have been reached by both the Memorandum of Understanding and this Forest Management Agreement. So all the decisions that have been taken in the last year over how to manage the forest are contradictory to the best science that I've seen about how to conserve the forest, how to make sure that the ecosystem is productive and can actually still produce trees into the future.
But maybe those aren't the values they were assessing.
Well, I would hope that the forest's ability to produce trees is one of the things that they care about, but that's maybe they're using science to more broadly describe other kinds of science than the ones that we normally think about.
Mr. Hardie, did you see any of the science?
No. The quick answer is no. And I mean, in all the feedback and activity, public activity, post the announcement of these MOAs, there were a lot of well-qualified people, academics, scientists that spoke out, and I don't think, they should be ignored. I know in some situations they've been tried to be dismissed as being reactionary and, just against any industrial expansion. And I mean, even us as an organization, we've been accused of being against this. But I mean, let's look at it this way. I mean, if the mills all closed, woodlot owners would be in a worse situation than we are currently. But on the other hand, by selling the farm secretly without telling the family, it's a bad situation.
Okay, so assuming Brian Gallant is listening to us this morning, then what do you want to see him do? What do you want to see the government do first, Mr. Hardie?
Well, they've inherited this file, so I would give them a little bit of room to get stuck in and study it and see where they stand. I mean, they should be on top of it. I would say it's part of the basis of why they formed the government. But the bottom line is they've inherited this huge file with some serious consequences built into these agreements. So I would give them a little, cut them a little slack and let them look at it. But I would hope they would see their way clear to make some adjustments that would allow our province to prosper.
Here's a note on Twitter. Why is no one saying Irving? Are they not the main benefactor of this agreement?
In terms of the agreement and wood supply, yeah, there's no doubt about it.
Okay.
And what I'd like to see the government do would be to evaluate all of the legislative options before them to make changes to this contract and fix the problems that exist with it. And I would also like to see them review the conclusions that were made to reduce the amount of habitat, wildlife habitat, and river conservation that's going to happen on Crown land. And I also want to make sure that they don't sign any more of these kinds of agreements and just add problem on top of problem while they're discussing things behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, both of you.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Harry.
Roberta Clowater is Executive Director of the New Brunswick chapter of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. Ken Hardie is Manager of the New Brunswick Federation of Woodlot Owners. Please get in touch at SEGUINCBC. You can send email to info@amfredericton@cbc.ca.